This is There Is No Light, a 2D action RPG set in a very, very strange world. But the first thing to talk about, this game is really hard, like extremely difficult. It's actually one of the hardest games I've played in a little while now. Now, it is actually difficult for a good reason, luckily. It's not cheap or artificially difficult, it is just very legitimately challenging. Aside from a couple of enemies that stand out in my mind as maybe having kind of wonky hitboxes here and there, it is actually difficult properly. But more on all that and the combat and stuff in a little bit, because the first thing I really want to talk about is the world of this game. They've done an extremely good job of making a really standout, weird world to explore, and this whole game has this really interesting sense of wanderlust, where every area is different from the last in a very large way, but it's also really alien in its own unique way, and I think unique is probably the word that I would use for this whole game in general. Its world is extremely well realized and very unique. At first it looks like it might be a dark fantasy world of some kind when you first start exploring, but then you start seeing steel and machinery and subway cars and things, and you realize that it's actually a lot more modern than you thought. It's not standard dark fantasy at all. And then early on in the game, you'll start finding notes and things mentioning places like Germany, and then it becomes clear that this is actually Earth. But it's Earth after a sort of apocalypse that has rendered it almost unrecognizable. From what I've gathered so far, based on the bits of lore that I've been able to uncover while exploring the game, it seems like this is a sort of alternate history Earth where during the 1900s people started to unearth various artifacts and structures that were not made by humans and had some very strange properties. And then at some point in the 90s, Lovecraftian entities came down to the surface of the Earth and basically took it over, pushing the remnants of humanity down into the metro and other underground areas to survive. But this event completely changed the planet and the entire atmosphere of everything, so that means there's all sorts of weird substances and crazy entities roaming around, and pretty much every faction in this game is worshipping something, some sort of strange being, and you start your journey in the Central Station, which is sort of like the hub of what's left of humanity. And the Central Station is ruled by the Solar Guard, who kind of remind me of the Imperium from 40K. They're basically like a fascist organization of religious zealots that keeps people malleable with a substance called wax. It's this strange substance that their sort of godlike being that they worship, called the Great Hand, has sort of gifted them with, and this stuff seems to work a lot like a drug. You take it and it makes you see and hear weird things, but it also keeps your willpower down and basically makes you accept whatever happens to you without the will to fight. So they basically feed all of their followers this stuff to keep them pleasant and tranquil. But every now and then the Great Hand comes down from the surface, and this thing, by the way, is an actual literal hand, and it steals a baby from someone, and that's actually how you start the game. Your baby was taken by the Great Hand. It's considered in this culture a positive thing, an honor to have your baby taken, but no one knows what actually happens to them after they're gone. They seemingly take them to the surface, and then that's it. No one ever sees them again. So your character is trying to figure out the mystery behind this whole thing, what's up with the Solar Guard, why they seem to be superhumans, and what's happening on the surface, and if there really is a war going on, or if there's something else happening that they don't want you to know about. And along the way, you'll find all sorts of other cultures and factions exist, like the Lunar Order, which are sort of like a resistance type of people, but they're not as pleasant as that might sound in a world like this. They're also really messed up. There's demon summoners, there are people that get blinded and then sent to a sort of manufactured hell. There are spiders in an abandoned depot that are actually friendly to humans. Although they look very menacing, they are nice, and they'll actually take humans to a safe area called Spiritina, I believe, in the middle of this metro tunnel, and you can actually live there in peace away from the orders. And the only price is that the spiders take your face because they like faces to look more human, it seems like. It's a really weird world. Like, everywhere you go, there's some incredibly strange happening. Basically, the entire place is just weirdness layered on top of weirdness, and that makes it really fascinating to explore. The lore is delivered to you in just conversations, some incidental, some that you actually are part of the story, as well as lost papers and books in certain areas and things like that, so you get to piece the lore together by yourself, but it is absolutely worth doing because they've created a world that is very much worth exploring. Every area is so alien, but also so unique to all the other areas that every time you enter a new place, you're just sort of taken back by the unexpected twists and turns that the story and areas have taken up to this point. Pretty much every area has a bit of a mystery to uncover and some mysterious entities to unmask, and so far I've been pretty much wrong about everything. Every time there's a major discovery, it's not what I thought, and it seems like everywhere is like that. But let's talk about the meat of the game, the combat. So this game has extremely blindingly fast combat. Basically, as soon as combat starts, you never stop moving until it's over. You have a dash that's on a very short cooldown and has very generous invulnerability frames, and simply a sword, just a sword to whack things with. And you have a basic 3-hit combo, as well as whenever you hit enemies with your basic attacks, you will generate rage. It's a red meter that's below your character, and once it's full, you can use a special attack dependent on the weapon you're using. These tend to be very powerful, and they also generate, you see those little purple notches below the health gauge in the top left? Those are healing shard notches, and every time you use your special attack, it will generate one of these, and once this gauge fills up, a healing shard will spawn, which you can then smack with your sword for 1 bit of healing. Your health gauge has 6 segments, which is not very many, by the way. This means you can take about 2 to 3 hits before you die, because most enemy attacks will take 2 segments, although some can shave off half your health in 1 hit. And every mechanic in the combat of this game is to encourage aggressiveness. It's to be on the offensive at all times. Everything about this game's combat is just pure aggression all the time. You're meant to be dodging and attacking constantly, because you need to keep this rage meter building up so that you can keep using your special attack for extra damage, and to generate healing shards, you need to keep dashing out of the way of enemy attacks. There are attacks that have a red flash above the enemy's head. These can be interrupted if you hit them when that flash is happening, so that you can actually stun an enemy in place. There are also attacks with a yellow flash above the enemy's head. These can only be interrupted if you hit them with the special attack on time, but it does stun them for a decent couple of hits worth of time, so it's always worth doing. And there's even an upgrade for your sword that makes it to where if you successfully interrupt a yellow attack, you get 2 healing shard charges instead of just 1. You'll also be able to get a shield after you beat a certain boss, and this is not a guard as much as it's a parry, because you can't hold it up. It's instead a sort of AoE, fiery blast around you that you have to time just perfectly when an enemy is just about to hit you in order to absorb the attack. But even your defensive move has an offensive note to it, because you can only block an attack 1 time, and you'll get a charge above your rage meter. And if you try to block again while you have this charge, it'll stun you. It will successfully block the attack, so you won't take any damage from it, but it'll stun you in place for a minute. However, if you use your special attack while you have this charge, it will empower the special attack with fire and actually make it deal more damage. So even your shield is actually an offensive tool technically, because in order to use it effectively, you have to be building this meter and using special attacks to consume these charges so that you can keep parrying moves with it. There are also other weapons that you will obtain after you beat certain bosses, like for instance the Great Sword, which has some really fun mechanics. The combat starts quite simple with just your 3-hit combo, a dash attack, and a special attack, but as you unlock more moves and more weapons, it gets more complicated, and the Great Sword is really fun to use. It obviously swings more slowly, but it has a wider reach. It builds up charges on an enemy that can be detonated like a bomb with special attacks and do a ton of damage at once. Its special attack is an AoE around you that does huge damage. It's the most powerful one in the game, actually, and it can also be thrown. And the cool thing about the Great Sword when you throw it is you can actually use your normal sword to smack it in the air and move it around like a boomerang, just bounce it around the arena smacking it, and you can even upgrade the number of smacks and bounces that you can get from it. So this all comes together to mean that the combat is really, really active and extremely fast. Enemies are just blindingly fast all the time. You have to be constantly interrupting, constantly attacking, constantly dashing, and constantly using your various built-up charges and effects efficiently in order to actually get out of battle alive. Battles in this game are extremely lethal. You will either kill all the enemies very, very quickly, or you will die very quickly. Those are pretty much the only options, because the enemies don't have a lot of health, but neither do you. There are also some enemies that you'll find that have a white portion to their health gauge. They'll be made of white segments instead of red segments, and these basically have to be done in one combo. If you stop attacking when the white segments are showing in the health gauge, they'll all recharge pretty much instantly, so it basically heals them. You have to actually power down the white segments very, very quickly in order to get rid of them, or else they'll just recharge. Bosses, by the way, can also have white segments to their health gauge. They'll often have them in between phases, so you have to power down these phases very quickly. Some other stuff that makes this combat as hard as it is, one is that a lot of games like this have a grace period after you get hit where you're invulnerable for like 5 or 10 frames. You can't get hit too rapidly. This game does not have that. You can actually take multiple sources of damage on the same frame and die instantly. So you have to be very careful about things like overlapping attacks and standing in like a Venn diagram of AoEs on the ground, because all of them can hit you at once. And then there's also the healing system. So I mentioned the healing shards, but there are also med kits that you can find. Those are those 3 to 4 little notches that you see on the left of the health gauge. Those can be found in the world, and you can use them for a full heal whenever you have one. However, there's a bit of difficulty with this. There's actually 2 difficulties to this game, Warrior and Traveler, and they're not difficulties in the standard sense because they don't actually change how hard the combat is or anything like that. They don't change anything about the enemies or the damage that you do or the damage that enemies do. All the enemy damage and health and everything is the same. All the bosses are the same and everything across the difficulties. The only thing the difficulty changes is it gives you 1 rechargeable med kit that recharges every time you get to a checkpoint. And I am not ashamed to admit I actually set the difficulty down to Traveler after a little while because I found the normal difficulty was a little bit too punishing for me because of one reason. The medkits are single use, and I don't mean you can use them once per spawn, I mean they're single use permanently. Like if you use them once, they're gone for good. So if you fight a boss and you have a couple of medkits that you picked up in the world, you use them but still die, your second attempt on that boss has to be done without any healing because the medkits don't come back. If you go back to where you got them originally, they don't respawn when you do. So basically all of the medkits in this game are single use only, and I kept dying so fast to bosses that I didn't feel like I was learning anything, so I ended up setting it to Traveler difficulty so I could have at least that 1 heal that I could take with me. You know, I felt it was reasonable to have 1 rechargeable heal that I could take into a boss fight instead of having none. You know, this game is already crazy difficult as it is, so it didn't really bother me that setting it down to Traveler, because, like I said, it doesn't make the combat any easier, it just gives you 1 medkit that you can take with you instead of having to exhaust all the ones in the world. You'll also see that purple vertical meter up there in the top left, and this is like an experience gauge basically. As you kill enemies, it fills up, and when it fills up, you get 1 skill point. You can also find these little purple orbs around the place, usually off the beaten path somewhere, in hidden doors or in little difficult to reach alcoves and things like that, and these will give you about half a gauge worth of experience whenever you find them, so they're worth finding. And whenever you're at a checkpoint, you can of course fast travel to other checkpoints that you found, as well as view a skill tree. And the cool thing is there's actually a skill tree for all 3 weapons in the game and for your shield, so there's actually quite a lot of skills to purchase. And different skills cost a different amount of points, most of which are around like the 3 to 5 point range, but there are some that get more expensive, like around 9 or 10. And these are all really useful. They give you extra special moves for your weapons, they give you extra mechanical improvements to your weapons, like the aforementioned great sword bouncing around more times. And they also give you really, really useful stuff, like there's one for your shield that is arguably one of the best ones in the entire game that makes your healing item not have an animation. It just heals you instantly. You don't have to go through the healing animation anymore, so you just press the button and it heals you immediately. And that is extremely useful and almost necessary in the later stages of the game when huge numbers of enemies can be swarming you, and like I said, all of the enemies in this game are like blindingly fast, so stopping to heal isn't always an option. There's also a karma system in the game, interestingly enough. Sometimes when you're talking to different NPCs, you'll get an option to agree or disagree with what they're saying, and depending on your choices, this little red and green gauge pops up that's sort of like a jerk or good guy karma meter, and it will start traveling in either direction depending on what you say. There are also side quests around the game, and one of the big rewards for these side quests is actually a larger chunk of progress on this karma meter. And there are these 3 notches on either side of the karma meter, and once the meter reaches those notches, they'll light up that color. However, because this game is so incredibly cryptic, I actually have no idea what they do, which I think is kind of a mistake, because if you're going to expect the player to work towards the extreme ends of this gauge, you should at least tell them what they're working for. And as it stands right now, I've lit up some of these notches, and I still have no idea what they do. I'm sure they give me some benefit, but the game doesn't tell you what. I should also mention, by the way, that the music in this game is phenomenal. It's all really good stuff. All of the combat and boss music is just really nice and memorable, but also the calm area, the safe zone music, like in the main central station or in any of the smaller settlements that you can find around the place, all that music is really good. It's got this sort of somber tone to it. All the music is kind of sad, but it's also tranquil at the same time, and it just sounds really, really nice. I'm a big fan of the restaurant music from the central station, which is like a jazz piano kind of mix-up. It sounds really, really nice. Overall, I think it's a really solid game, actually. Despite a couple of issues with how cryptic it can be sometimes, it's still a really good game. It also has an extremely large-scale world. This game is probably going to take you around 20 to 30 hours to complete, which is quite sizable for a game like this, and it's also very open. There are 3 main pathways you can go from the beginning, each one leading through several areas, through a couple of bosses, and eventually one big story-important boss, which will get you a new weapon and progress towards the ultimate end goal. And you can do any of these in any order that you want, which is nice, especially in a game that's this difficult, because it means if you're having a lot of problems with one specific area, you have other areas that you can backtrack and then try those instead for now, and then see maybe if some of the stuff you get there will help you out. It's good to have multiple different options of ways to go in a very challenging game. But for me, the real standout is the world, the lore, and the story. It's all just so good. It's very well written. There are a couple of lines here and there that sound a little bit stiff, like maybe the translation is just a little slightly flawed, but we're talking like barely. It doesn't really matter much. But there's just this constant sense of very memorable wonder as you're exploring these areas and finding out the mysteries behind all these crazy entities and the Lovecraftian happenings that are actually going around. It's just a really cool world that I just want to keep exploring more of, and that's what's really kept me playing the whole time, even when the game has gotten like extremely hard, because I've wanted to see what the next area is. I want to see the next boss. I want to see what the end of the game is like. It's just a fascinating world that keeps pushing you along and makes you want to see what happens next because you have no idea what it could be. So yeah, I definitely recommend this game because it's a memorable, very difficult action RPG in a fascinating world. So the link will, as always, be in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you would like to check it out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.